I would like to request everyone to please launch the book.
Good evening. We will begin the program in another 10 minutes. We're waiting for the interim president, Professor Irfan Habib, to join us. He will be presiding over this session, and Professor Aditya Mukherjee is already here. Before we begin that, let me just introduce the cultural program that we have this evening. We have a very renowned folk singer called Shri Tipania, who will be performing Kabir bhajans in the Malvi folk style, which is very typical of the Madhya Pradesh region. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy that. Please do stay on after the S.C. Mishra lecture. We will be having this program. Please do hold on to your patience for another 10 minutes. Thank you. Extremely sorry. Professor Irfan Habib is already here. He's the president of this session, and he will be presiding over the Professor S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture. Sir, please. May I invite Professor Aditya Mukherjee to come onto the dais? Thank you. Professor Aditya Mukherjee needs no introduction in this body of historians, but to be very brief, he retired as Professor of Modern Indian History from the Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, an authority on the growth of Indian capitalism in the modern and contemporary periods. He is a scholar who has made a significant mark in the historiography of modern India, along with Professor Bipin Chandra and Professor Mridula Mukherjee, authored the very famous and well-known works, India's Struggle for Independence and India Since Independence. Many of the works of Professor Aditya Mukherjee, which he has co-authored with Professor Mridula Mukherjee and others, have been translated into several languages in the world, across the world. So, a great privilege to have Professor Aditya Mukherjee giving the S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture. I'd particularly like to thank him for accepting our invitation to speak at very short notice. It was really very generous of him to do so. I now hand over to Professor Irfan Habib, our president.
Sir Aditya Mukherjee to deliver the Professor S.C. Mishra lecture, memorial lecture.
I'm thankful to Professor Irfan Habib Professor Shireen Musvi, Professor Mahalakshmi, for this honor to deliver the S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture. As it is a formal lecture, I shall read most of my presentation, which those of you who know me, which I do not generally like to do. The 19th century, the lecture is titled A Relook at the 19th Century and the Theory of the Great Divergence. The 19th century is a critical century in the historiography of global history, as this is the period when the process of the Great Divergence between the West and the rest occurs at a very heightened level. The Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel once argued that on a long-term historical scale of the evolution of human civilization over several millennia, the domination of Europe and later America, which is collectively often referred to as the West, the domination of Europe is a relatively brief and very recent phenomenon. In his words, if you take the entire period from the beginning of human civilization till today, European domination is a tiny little blip around the 19th century, 19th, late 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Yet, the European intellectual ideological hegemony or a Eurocentric worldview has remained long after European political and economic domination waned by the end of the 19th century, or by the end of the so-called long 19th century, that is, by the First World War. This is because many of the modern disciplines of the social sciences emerged precisely in this period of European domination and carried in their birth a deep imprint of the Eurocentric imagination of human society from the ancient period to the present. Thus, we continue to look upon this world with Eurocentric glasses even till today. It is the continuing domination of the Eurocentric worldview which partially explains why the role of European colonial expansion in explaining the emergence of the great divergence between the West and the rest, or the so-called South, has not been forefronted sufficiently in the literature on the rise of modern Western civilization. Instead, Europe's rise has been sought to be explained by focusing on Europe's own uniqueness. In recent times, however, this view has been seriously questioned. André Gunder Frank, in his book published posthumously, has argued that in seeking answers for European development within Europe, without any reference to the global political economy, and I'm quoting him now, he says, is truly a case of looking for one's watch, not where it was lost, but only where the all too dim and narrowly focused Euro-American street light is. That's where you're looking for your watch. Similarly, a scathing critique of the Eurocentric view that Europe is supposed to have had some intrinsic advantage or capabilities that put it ahead of the rest of the world, and for the exposition of the argument that Western capitalist modernization actually based itself on colonial surplus appropriation from the rest of the world, has been made by Omyo Kumar Bagchi in my opinion, in a fascinating work called Perilous Passage, Mankind and the Global Ascendancy of Capital. Others, like recently Professor Sven Beckert, has written again a monumental book called The Empire of Cotton, where he's made a similar argument, arguing that the rise of capitalism, in fact, he says, is achieved by letting loose, the word he uses is war. He calls it a phase of war capitalism. That it is by letting loose war upon the rest of the world was the rise of capitalism possible. I have also, in my small way, tried to make the similar argument, arguing against positions taken by people like Niall Ferguson, who wrote this amazing book, the title of which tells you the whole argument. The title of his book is Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World. So you don't need to read anything after that. So the Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World. So I tried to write a critique with a title called Empire, How Colonial India Made Modern Britain. Part of what I will present today will try to substantiate this argument. The 19th century, as I said, is a critical century which needs to be revisited from the point of view of the global South. Not only colonial historians like Maurice de Maurice and Tirthankar Roy and others, but even some of the very eminent anti-imperialist historians like Eric Hobsbawm have, in my opinion, taken sometimes a Eurocentric understanding of the 19th century. Among those who do not take a Eurocentric position, also we see a certain amount of divergence in their understanding. And the divergence is on the issue of the timing of the Great Divergence, as well as on the incidents. Which countries, which part of the world, at what point of time witnesses this divergence. I'll have something to say on that as well. Before I do that, a very quick look at the Eurocentric bias that I suggest one can find in Hobsbawm. I choose Hobsbawm because, in my opinion, he is one of the greatest historians the world has produced. And yet, this is what Eurocentrism is, that unless you try to put yourself in the shoes of the other, you, without even realizing it, absorb positions which emerge from your own positioning, whatever it may be. Let us take a look. Hobsbawm, in his celebrated work Age of Extremes, the short 20th century, argues the following. He says the long 19th century, it's a term that he uses to describe the period till 1914, with the understanding that historical time doesn't necessarily come in 100-year sets. So the 19th century phenomenon really continues till 1914, and the 20th century phenomenon, which he calls the short 20th century, is from 1914 till about the 1980s. So he says the long 19th century is a period of almost unbroken, I'm quoting him, unbroken material, intellectual, and moral progress. That is to say, improvements in the conditions of civilized life. So this is a great century. And then he says, the short 20th century, he says, begins with an age of what he calls the catastrophe. So from 1914 to 45, he says, is the catastrophe, the wars, the depression, etc. And then a brief golden age, which comes to an end in the 1970s, and the last quarter of the 20th century, he says, is again a catastrophe. When you read this, you realize that had you not been positioned writing this in England, but if you were positioned in New Delhi or in Beijing, this would seem absurd. The 18th century is where countries like India and China dominate the world. 47% of the global GDP is produced by India and China. Asia, excluding Japan, contributed more than half, about 58% of the global GDP, which was 2.5 times the GDP produced by Europe and USA put together. So Asia is producing 2.5 times the GDP of Europe and USA in the beginning of the 18th century. the 19th century, instead of being a period of unbroken material, intellectual, moral progress, was in fact a period of catastrophe for Asia, for India and China, for Latin America, for Africa. It was not the great period. India and China's contribution to the world GDP, which was, as I said, more than double of West Europe and USA at the beginning of the 18th century, comes down to a third of West Europe and USA by 1913, one third. And by 1950, that is at the point of their independence, it has come down to 1/6 of West Europe and USA. So from 2.5 times, these countries have been reduced. So the great 19th century has actually produced the decimation of an overwhelming part of the world. And that it should not enter the historiography of one of the greatest historians of the world is what Eurocentrism is made of. The trend, however, reverses after the decolonization happens, after the 1950s. Again, you find, and I will, towards the end, if there is time, give you figures on that, Asia beginning to claw back its position as the dominant economy in the world once again. So it is not only India and China. In fact, one example that is often not given and which should be remembered is that of Egypt. Egypt, in fact, half a century before Japan does so, makes an attempt to build capitalism from the top in a massive hothouse manner and succeeds amazingly under Muhammad Ali. By the 1840s, Egypt is emerging as what Japan was by the end of the 19th century, until it is colonized by England and France together. And the whole effort is decimated bit by bit by bit, and the shock of which Egypt has not been able to undo even till today. The world indeed would have looked very different if you had in that region where Egypt is an advanced capitalist country like Japan. So the impact of colonialism is so amazing and so important. You begin to realize when you look at specific cases like Egypt. A closer look at the data suggests that there is some internal differentiation within Asia. It is notable that Asia's domination of the global economy, particularly that of China, continued well into the 19th century. This is the point that Gunther Frank has been making forcefully. He says in 1820s, Asia was still contributing about 56% of the global GDP, and which was much higher than West Europe and USA. And China, in fact, substantially increased its share of global GDP from 22% to 33% in 1820. So in the early 19th century, China is actually growing. It is not, the divergence hasn't become. But Frank overstates the matter when he says that the divergence with Asia began closer to the 1870s or 1880s. He's suggesting that this is clearly wrong. Because Asia's contribution to the global GDP, in fact, falls sharply from the 1820s till the 1870s. From about 56%, it comes down to 36%, and continues to fall to 22% by 1913. China's contribution also fell sharply before 1870. So I would argue that Gunther Frank is wrong in suggesting that the divergence begins at the end of the 19th century. And this is partly because Frank is not even looking at the data on India. In the Indian case, the divergence begins much earlier than China. In fact, almost a century before China, as India is indeed colonized nearly a century earlier. The Indian economy begins to experience the devastating impact of colonialism much earlier, as I said, and India's contribution to the global GDP begins to decline from about 24.4% in 1700 to 16% by 1820. So it has shrunk by 1820s already, whereas China has grown till the 1820s and begins to shrink after that. The point one is making is that there is a link between the acquiring of colonial power to the timing of the beginning of divergence. When an economy begins to move the other way, can be almost directly linked to the timing of its being colonized. Beckert also argues with the view that the divergence begins much earlier than the late 19th century, and he sees it as we see it, beginning towards the end of the 18th century. It is significant, and I'll just spend 2 minutes on this because I'm going to talk on the 19th century and not the later period. It is significant that Hobsbawm's description of the 20th century is also so Eurocentric. He describes the period 1914 to 45 as a catastrophe. It was indeed a catastrophe for Europe, as I said, the world wars and the depression, but all studies of colonial situations show that this was precisely the period when the colonial economies were able to make a surge forward because of what Professor Bipin Chandra called the loosening of the links with imperialism. It is because of imperialism being tied up in its own affairs, so to speak, because of the wars and the depression, that colonial economies like India, like Indonesia, like parts of Latin America, this has been demonstrated by Gunder Frank for Latin America, for India by Professor Bipin Chandra, that there were spurts of growth. So what was good for us appears to be a catastrophe to him. But most importantly, the fact that it is in the last quarter of the 20th century that Asia begins to come to its own, and once again, by 2001, becomes the largest contributor to the global GDP. By 2001, 31% of the global GDP is contributed by Asia, excluding Japan, which is 1.5 times that of either West Europe put together or the United States. And this, what we call the Asian century, Hobsbawm is calling the catastrophe. That is again Eurocentrism for you. A different genre of Eurocentrism altogether is the one which mixes Eurocentrism with colonial ideology. Hobsbawm is not colonial, he's anti-imperialist. He's a Marxist, he's one of the finest scholars in the field, but I said that even in that there are elements of Eurocentrism. But there is a mixing of Eurocentrism with colonialism, the neo-colonial or colonial argument, which I would like to focus on now. Scholars belonging to this colonial or neo-colonial genre are in complete denial of the negative impact of colonialism on the colonies, and in fact, which Hobsbawm is certainly not, and in fact argues the opposite. They see colonialism as the harbinger of development. To give you an example, Maurice de Morris, for example, argues that the 19th century had growth benefits, I'm quoting him as he calls, for India, including industrial growth. But he says the 19th century as a period was too brief. It was too small to achieve all the structural changes needed to provide the precondition for an industrial revolution. So the 19th century did a lot of good to India, but it was not long enough for that good to happen. This reminds me often of my teacher, Professor Bipin Chandra, who used to always give very examples, very earthy examples. He used to give this example of, he was from Kangra, which many of you might remember, those who have attended his classes. He used to give this example of a wedding group walking from one village to the other. They've gone to a wedding and they're returning. And on the return, everybody gossips. You know, how did the bride look? Was she fair? Was she this? Was she that? How was the food? So somebody says the food was very bad. And the roti was like gobar. And she says, not only was it like gobar, there was not enough of it. Now, he says, this is, if something is like gobar, how can you say that there wasn't enough of it? So if colonialism was bad in the 19th century, how would more of it help? But that's it. So according to Maurice de Morris, the 19th century was just not long enough. Had it been longer, of course, there would have been growth. Instead, he says, after 1914, there were substantial structural modifications that occurred, which laid the base for a renewed upward surge after independence. This is the origin of the argument that what you achieved after independence is also because of them. So colonialism not only takes away what you had in the colonial period, it takes away your achievements of what you achieve after the colonial period. So the entire growth of East Asia and Southeast Asia that you're witnessing in the last half a century is now said to be because of colonialism. It is because we had colonized these areas that Korea, China, India, etc. are growing so well, because we created the conditions. Now this is completely wrong. I have argued elsewhere in great detail. In fact, in my presidential address in Modern India in 2007, that the growth that you see in the 20th century is not growth that occurs because of colonialism. It is growth that occurs, I argue, in spite of and in opposition to colonialism. It is growth that is wrenched out, a space which is wrenched out of colonialism, which cannot be seen as the gift or as the result of colonialism. So it's completely wrong. In any case, analytically what they're doing is they're taking data from the 20th century, where there is actually some positive development, to argue an overall growth model for the 19th century, saying that had the 19th century been a little longer, then all these things would have happened in the 19th century itself. Very bad history indeed. A much more blatant example of this genre of colonial historiography is, of course, my friend Tirthankar Roy, who strangely receives much praise from scholars like Ramchandra Guha and Sanjay Subramaniam. I don't know why, but they do. They take time off to write on his cover that this is a fantastic work and stuff like that. Now, what does he argue? Roy, in the name of modern revisionist history, reiterates almost all the arguments of the British civil servants. And he reiterates them in a manner that would make even Lord Curzon blush, that we were good, but not that good. But he does. And lest you think that I am overstating, which I cannot in a memorial lecture like this, I'll just quote a few of the gems from his work, which he says is a shortened version, shorter and updated version of the Cambridge Economic History Volume 2, in which he says, colonial India experienced positive economic growth. In the 19th century, he says, it was driven by India's integration in a rapidly growing world market, and other key factors encouraging economic growth were a strong state, a modern transport and communication system. So integration into the world market, a strong state, and modern transport and communication brought positive growth. But then he's not happy with just saying positive growth. He says real income in industry and services grew rapidly. So not only did we grow in the 19th century, we grew rapidly throughout colonial rule. Then he says commercialization. Basically what he's done, those of you who have had the good fortune of studying economic history will find that he turns upside down almost anything that we had learned over the last 100 years. He says the notion that there was commercialization, that commercialization of agriculture was forced upon the peasantry because of the taxes and the debt that they were driven to, and it was not driven by profit motive, he says is disputable. So Indian peasantry went into commercialization like the peasantry in the independent countries in order to become rich peasant and then capitalist farmers. Then you have his the gem, he says the indebtedness of the peasantry, Indian peasantry, was a sign of prosperity. It is because the Indian peasant was very prosperous that he became indebted. So you don't have to, those who are Punjab scholars, don't have to think very hard where this fantastic gem has come from. It has come from the Punjab civil servant Malcolm Darling's book, the title of which is Punjab Peasants in Prosperity and Debt. So they were so prosperous that they became indebted, like the American peasant who borrows to buy an aircraft to spray his fields, who borrows to buy a silo, etc. So Indian peasant to rub salt on their wounds, who are at the point, who are prone to famine, who are at the point of going below subsistence level, is apparently in debt because he's prosperous. The deindustrialization thesis is unsatisfactory and must be replaced, he says, I'm quoting him, by an alternative story. I think this must have been a Freudian slip. He doesn't say alternative theory, he says alternative story. It has to be a story. Then he goes on to say, the most important legacy of British rule is the modern infrastructure and public goods that it created. Assets India could believably have not acquired had they not come under British political domination. In other words, without British rule, we could never have made the transition to modernity. But even Tirthankar Roy finds that we did not have rapid economic growth, though he says so, but that India was not a very rich country in the 19th century. So you need an explanation. So the explanations of slow growth rates, he says, is the local characteristics and peculiarities. Rather than holding colonialism responsible, the reason why India is backward is something is wrong with you. Something is wrong with your climate, there is a scarcity of water, there is scarcity of capital, all the shibboleths that you have in Western historiography and among economists. Indian capital is shy, they hide their capital under the carpet, etc., etc. The shyness disappears suddenly, with independence, I don't know how, but apparently they were very shy. And as we heard in the morning in Professor Gopinath's paper, that the real problem is population growth. Then institutions like caste, the hunger for gold, the women wanting to buy gold jewelry, then Indians having sumptuous marriage feasts, etc., etc. All this you would have normally read only in the writing of colonial officials. But here is an economic historian who is positioned in no less than the London School of Economics and whose books are read, believe you me, in Delhi University, the best university for undergraduate studies in the country. That is the colonization of the mind, and that is Eurocentrism among non-Europeans. Let us assess these claims. There is no doubt tremendous expansion in the volume of international trade in the 19th century. By one estimate, the total value of foreign trade in India increased more than 50 times between 1835 and 1924. There are other estimates which have put it even higher, but I'm giving you one conservative estimate that there is no doubt about it, that foreign trade increases in a massive manner. The second fact is that not only does India's, and this is what Tirthankar Roy says is a driving factor for growth, that we are integrated into the world market. So it is true that India's foreign trade increases in a phenomenal manner. It is also true that the balance of trade, that is India's export surplus, also grows rapidly in this period. So, and the colonial officials then used to argue that why are these babus always criticizing us? Look here, British rule has brought you much greater foreign trade and it has brought you export surpluses. We've never had a export surplus, you may know, you may remember, since independence till today. But throughout the colonial period, we had great export surpluses. So we had this peculiar situation where in the 19th century, for example, trade increases balance of trade is in our favor, foreign investments increase, transport and communication develops faster than in England and France. Yet, the overall economy stagnates. To use the language of economists, the production function actually shifts leftwards. That is, the economy becomes smaller and less productive. This is what Gunter Frank had put it in 3 words. This is what is the development of underdevelopment. You are witnessing what appears to be development, but is actually leading to the underdevelopment of the economy. So the 19th century is the classic example of that. Now, why are we saying this? Why is this foreign trade, increase in foreign trade, no good for us? One aspect of it is very well known, that the pattern of foreign trade is completely reversed in this period, where India, from being one of the largest producers and exporters of cotton textiles in the world till the end of the 18th century, and where India had a share of the manufacturing output of the world of something nearly as high as 20%. You know, we have been struggling with 0.5% over the last decade or so of share of global manufacture. Now, we had 20% of the share of the global manufacture at that time. So from that, this shift in the pattern of foreign trade, that is pushing Indian exports of manufacturers from the global market and preventing those commodities to survive in India, leads to a situation where the foreign trade is now of British exports of cotton goods to India, which increases by about 100 times in less than 25 years, from about 1 million yard, less than 1 million yard in 1815 to about 100 million yards in 1839. So what you're witnessing is that India's exports of manufactured goods has completely shrunk and India's imports of manufactured goods have increased. So there is an increase in foreign trade, of course, but a completely altered pattern of foreign trade. Now this I don't need to labor this point because this is very well known and well accepted. But what must be remembered is that the ousting of Indian textiles from its global and domestic market was, on the one hand, critical for British industrialization. On the other, that it set a process of deindustrialization in the country, which caused untold misery to millions dependent on this industry. Any famine commission report that you pick up will start by saying that the first people who die are the dispossessed weavers and the spinners. So obviously, you know, it devastates the artisanal section of our society, and it has a massive impact on agriculture. But the claim is that there was no deindustrialization. I'm not going to go into this debate. When Maurice de Morris first argued this position, 3 very tall economic historians, Vipin Chandra, Tapan Ray Chaudhary, and Toru Matsui, decimated that argument, and for 20 years nobody argued that. Till in the 1980s, this position again came back. Colonial intellectual domination does not die, just as communalism doesn't die if you win one election, unless one has a consistent struggle against that ideological formation. So the colonial position did not die. It was for nearly 100 years long struggle, starting by our early nationalists, did put it on so much on the back foot that they had to leave. But it did not die. And given the right conditions, which we are now very busy providing, they make a comeback. So the comeback was made in the 1980s, and with to cap it all, the Cambridge Economic History was replaced by the Oxford Economic History of Tirthankar Roy, where now the complete reversal has been made, and it is argued that there was no such thing as deindustrialization at all. I think Gunter Frank in this position, a slight aside here, he is also slightly off the mark when he sees the 1870s and 80s as a period when industrialization began to take hold in the major economies, he says, of Japan, India, and China. Again, it's quite amazing. The developments of Meiji Japan are in no way comparable to the colonized economies of China and India. Japan, in fact, as you know, stands out as a contrast, demonstrating that its not getting colonized was critical in its charting out a different growth path. The minuscule attempt to start a modern textile industry in India in the second half of the 19th century, against very severe obstruction by the colonial state, in no way compensated for the massive destruction of the traditional textiles industry. In fact, much of this debate on deindustrialization, I would argue, would seem somewhat unnecessary if we just look at three economic facts which are more or less undisputed. That in the 19th century, we did not witness a massive increase in population. You heard a brilliant lecture in the morning on this, that there was a very minor, if any, increase in population in the 19th century. The increase in population only happens in the 20th century, and that too after the 1920s. So certainly there is no increase in population. Nobody, not even Lord Curzon, argues that in the 19th century per capita incomes grew very fast. But, so this is an accepted fact. Incomes constant, population constant. It is also an accepted fact that imports increase by, dozens of times. Now, where does that import go? If the consumption in the country, if Indian exports have been cut out, if Indian domestic market for textiles has been cut out, where does the imports go? So obviously it is cutting into Indian industry. So this is, as I said, one can just analytically work this out, that the import increase could not be explained by increased consumption due to population increase or increase in per capita income. It had to be explained only through deindustrialization. Returning to the Indian economy's integration to the world market, the aspect which is not sufficiently highlighted, though again, beginning from Dadabhai Naoroji, he did bring it to the forefront, then it disappeared from our economics by the time K.T. Shah was done with it. So in the 30s and 40s, one was still talking about it. Then it became unfashionable to talk of deindustrialization till it was resurrected, to talk about, drain, till it was resurrected by Saira Habib, Irfan Habib, Utsa Patnaik, Sunanda Sen and others in recent times. That once again one began to talk about it. Now this export surplus that India had was what represented the transfer of surplus from India to the West. It was the drain that was represented by the export surplus. It did not benefit India. That export surplus was equal to what was taken away. In fact, Indian agriculture performed a dual task. One of the internal drain, that is the taxes that were raised from which were to be transferred abroad, were raised from the peasantry, and of making that internal drain, converting it into external drain. That is, the taxes that were raised, which were in rupees, they could not have been taken away in rupees. It had to be taken away in commodities, which means India had to have an export surplus, which is what Indian agriculture produced. So the taxes were converted into the commodities which we exported. So Indian agriculture performed essentially that role. In this context, there is another school that has beginning to become a bit fashionable again. It's argued by a major Japanese historian called Kaoru Sugihara, but Gunther Frank also tends to argue that, which is to talk of the intra-Asian trade that is happening in the 19th century. When the Japanese talk about Asian, their Asian kind of ends with Thailand. It doesn't somehow go further west. But whatever it is, this notion that this intra-Asian trade in the 19th century is seen as, I'm quoting, a resistance to the West and an index of renewal of economic growth and even of industry in Asia. Now this, to me, is completely unacceptable. This is based on very narrow levels of data. It does not include India. It does not even include China. I will just give you one example. Indo-Chinese trade, which is clearly intra-Asian trade, in the first half of the 19th century expanded very rapidly. Once Britain was not able to collect tribute from India in the form of the export of our textiles, which was got for free from Indian taxes, because India could no longer be allowed to produce textiles, the substitute was found in India producing opium, which was then forced on China by, quote unquote, civilizing China through gunport diplomacy. The result was that the opium trade between India and China increased phenomenally. It increased by about 6 times in 15 years, from 1860 to 1830. Professor Irfan Habib has written extensively about this. Now, this was perhaps the world's first and biggest state-sponsored drug trafficking in world history. And here we call it the civilizing of China, the opening up of China. Now, how did this intra-Asian trade either benefit India or represent resistance to the West? It, in fact, was the instrument of Britain being able to collect the tribute from India via China, and it was also the instrument of collecting Chinese tribute without having to pay for their tea and silk in bullion. So the decimation of the Chinese and the Indian economy, just because they were doing trade with each other, certainly cannot be seen as intra-Asian trade. Now this is one of a kind where you look at just increase in trade itself without seeing what is the nature of the trade, which is what is wrong. What India does is first does this triangular trade, and by the end of the 19th century, this triangular trade is replaced with a multilateral trade. India enters the global economy even more. And the classic example of India becoming an exporter of food and raw materials really happens in the second half of the 19th century, where India is exporting to the whole world, to the continent, to Japan, to the United States, to the white colonies. It's exporting food and raw materials, and we have an export surplus with all these countries. So India has a massive export surplus based on its multilateral trade all over the world. Britain has a balance of payment deficit with the rest of the world in this period for 2 reasons. One, because British exports to these countries have now declined, because these countries, being independent countries, that is the countries of continent and of United States and Japan, etc., are no longer buying British goods. So British exports of commodities has declined. But much more important, Britain develops a balance of payment deficit because Britain is now exporting capital, not commodities, but is exporting capital on an unprecedented scale in the second half of the 19th century. So it has a major balance of payment situation. And India fits into that through its multilateral trade. That is, through the export surplus that India earns throughout the world is now utilized by Britain to balance its own balance of payment deficits to the extent, believe you me, of 2/5. So 40%, and these are statistics produced by no less than Eric Hobsbawm himself, 40% of Britain's deficit is made up by what they appropriate from India, from India's export surplus. Some calculations have been made, many calculations have been made. I have mentioned, beginning from Saira Habib to Utsa Patnaik, of the size of the tribute. But an interesting calculation, which I want to present to you because it enables us to try and take a look, turn Eurocentric worldview around, put it on its head. It's the following. This calculation is made by Professor Bagchi, one of our most eminent economic historians. He calculates that the period when Britain is exporting the maximum amount of capital globally, mainly to America and to the white colonies, but to other parts of the world also, like Egypt, like China, etc., is the late 19th, early 20th century, from 1871 to 1916. the amount Britain British foreign investments, the total amount of British foreign investment in this period, he calculates to be about 4 billion pounds. The total amount that Britain takes away from India in the same period as tribute, he calculates to be 3.2 billion pounds. So something like 75% of what Britain is investing all over the world comes from India. Now what does this investment do? It, quote unquote, civilizes America, it discovers America, it decimates the indigenous people, it leads to the rise of this dynamic American capitalism, it creates a situation where Europe can offload their surplus population onto this newly discovered land of the indigenous Americans. So it raises standards of living in Europe, it raises standards of living in America. So it creates this new dynamic phase in the world, the rise of the United States. But on whose backs? As I said, if you turn it around, the massive flow of British capital to the white colonies and to the USA, to the great advantage of British economy and the emergence of a dynamic capitalism in USA and the white colonies, was funded by the severest exploitation of colonies like India. It is when Indian or academics from the South begin to write their history not from a Shashtang Pranam position to the West, but from a position of equality, position of strength, when they're arriving at the economic high table, which they are doing now. China, India are moving rapidly towards it, growing 3, 4, 5 times most of Europe and the US, etc. When it is also, along with the economic arrival at the economic high table, when the intellectual high table begins to be occupied, is when we are going to look at global economic history in a different manner. India was to contribute, as I said, not only through commodities, through capital, to the making of the West and to the rise of the West in the 19th century. It was also to contribute through providing labor, something that is quite often not recognized. Simply because we didn't have slavery like we had in Africa, we do not often take into account the fact that once slavery was abolished, the substitute for slavery, once slavery was abolished, the need for slaves did not go. The substitute for slavery was found in the indentured labor system that came up in India on a massive scale after 1834. By one estimate, more than 2 million indentured laborers were exported from India between 1831 and 1920. Very large number indeed. Other estimates put it much higher, but we know it for a fact that in most of the areas where they went, Indians became the most important population in those areas. For example, by 1930s, 65% of the population in Mauritius was Indian, 42% in British Guiana was Indian, 34% in Trinidad, 43% in Fiji. So huge migration of Indian labor in slave-like conditions, which is so beautifully brought out in the writing of Amitabh Ghosh, The Sea of Poppies. Lastly, to nail the final argument of the strong state and transport and communication. Transport and communication for what? What did it achieve? This notion, and this is what the tallest of liberal, even nationalist economists, rarely historians, have argued that, British rule was bad here, it did damage there, etc., etc. But then we got something out of it. We got the railways, we got believe you me, an education system, it is said, no less than a former Prime Minister said it, that we got the education system from the British. The land of the Nalanda had to wait for the British to come and give us an education system. The education system which we are still trying to undo. I was trying to give you an example right through the beginning of my talk, that we still have to undo. This colonial education system is supposed to be a benefit. The railways, to take just one example, had a zero positive impact, if not a negative impact, not on the Indian society. It had no forward or backward linkages at all. It did not act as it did in the independent countries of the West, as Marx talks about, as the stimulus for industrialization of those countries. The mirror image of what happened in the West does not happen by the building of the railways in the colonies. The entire investment, if £1 million were invested in Indian railways, almost all of it was spent in England to buy the locomotives, to buy the steel, to buy the tracks, to buy everything. India did not produce anything. So what it stimulated was the capital good industry in England. It did not have any backward linkages in India at all. And as for the forward linkages, that is what the railways did, we know, is precisely completely transform the pattern of trade that existed in the past. In other words, the railways, the strong state, the civil service, the police were instruments of our oppression. They were the instruments of the subversion of modern capitalist development in favor of colonial structuring. And this subversion cannot be treated as the residual or the partial benefits of colonialism. This is one of the most difficult arguments to get across, one finds. The notion that maybe so many things are wrong, but at least you got your railways, at least you got this, and at least you got that. You did not. The opportunity cost of not building the right railways or not making the right investments at the right time and trying to do them now 300 years later or 200 years later, the costs of having to undo the colonial structuring after colonialism has gone needs to be calculated. It is, I've argued elsewhere, talked about the painstaking effort that were required for the first 30 to 40 years after independence to undo this colonial structuring in all aspects, including in the building of the railways. They connected the wrong places to the wrong places. They didn't connect what you needed to connect. So you needed to undo all that. It took 30 to 40 years in each colonial country, after which only they were in a position to open out to the world again, whether it is China or whether it is India. China opens up in 78, India opens out even much later, because you required that period of unstructuring. Now, this period of unstructuring of colonialism has also been taken away by colonial and neo-colonial historiography by us, by people like Lord Desai and like so many other lords these days. He also spouts a lot of wisdom. And Tirthankar Roy and others, who describe these 30 or 40 years, the Nehru years, as the wasted years. Apparently, that was the time when nothing good happened. The great past of Indian history was the colonial period and then the neoliberal opening up to the world after 1991. So the Nehruvian period also, as I said, that part of our history which resisted colonialism, which undid colonialism, is also denied to us. And I believe what I would like to convey through this lecture today is the need for all of us to relook at this complete subversion of our own history. Thank you very much.
Friends, we have had a very brilliant lecture. It's seldom that I agree with every word of a lecturer. I am that type, but this is an occasion in which I couldn't agree more. If I could agree 110%, I would be very grateful. The few remarks that I would like to make are that we must distinguish between British European colonial exploitation and modern culture and modern ideas. That distinction should always be there. Let us remember that the first critic of colonialism after Plassey was no Indian but Adam Smith. He said that any Indian ruler, his interests would be very different. His own personal, private interests would be very different from those of the English East India Company. And therefore, an Indian ruler's rule would always be better than a foreigner's rule, such as the East India Company. You can look at it in his book, Wealth of Nations. A chapter first, there was a simple paragraph, and then he strengthened it. I have never had a very good opinion of Hobsbawm's Marxism, and I'm a small man, but my debate with criticism of him goes back to 1960s, when I thought that he was totally misrepresenting Marxism when he talked about Asiatic despotism, and he totally disregarded Marx's writings on India. And the very important portion of Capital, Volume 1, in which Marx regarded colonialism as one of the pillars of capitalist accumulation in Europe. That kind of heritage of Marxist thought is totally absent from Eric Hobsbawm. Also absent in his 20th century is a major event in Asia, the abolition of landlordism across Soviet Union, China, and a large part of India. That's also missing in his book, that this entire social change that took place in the latter half of the 19th century, or in fact in the 19th century, in the 20th century, over a major part of the world is totally ignored by him. So there are certainly very important weaknesses in Hobsbawm's historiography. He often looks to me like the British version of Bernstein, and I am very glad that Professor Mukherjee had also the same opinion about Hobsbawm's historical writings in relation to Asia. What Professor Mukherjee has said, Professor Aditya Mukherjee has said, is also very important for us in India today. Soon after independence, I did my BA examination from Aligarh. And in my BA examination in economics, which I took as my subject, there was one whole paper on Indian economics. And in that paper, there was all this about deindustrialization, commercialization of agriculture for British interests, tribute, Dadabhai Mukherjee, R.C. Dutt were always in our syllabus. We had no nonsense about what Tirthankar Roy talks about. We had everything in black and white, let us say. And then, of course, independence came, and we thought that our government was trying to build a free, colonialism-free Indian economy. And at that time, Delhi School of Economics, Rao and others were the great biblical authorities for us. All that has now changed. We may be independent, but our thoughts are not independent. We have learnt certain practices from Europe, we might be learning from Tirthankar Roy, but as far as our ideology is concerned, we have rejected modern thought at all, entirely. We are in the grips of an ideological reactionary offensive. These things can't go together. You can't be an independent nation, you can't be free of colonialism, and your ideology should be that of a medieval type country married to modern fascism. Therefore, it's important that while we take an anti-colonial position in historiography, we should also reject irrationalism, we should reject communalism, and if possible, even I would say, let's go back to 1950s, when we were trying, hopefully, to build a free, democratic India. So we hope that these days will pass, and as our late president in his last message indicated this morning, that was read out by Dr. Rakesh Baptial, we will try to cleanse our ideology and to learn human truths freely from modern civilization and modern thought. That's very essential. It's as essential as our struggle against colonialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Professor Irfan Habib, for presiding over this session, and Professor Aditya Mukherjee for that wonderful lecture. Maybe you can stretch your legs for about 10-15 minutes, because our musicians would need to set their instruments up. Or, of course, you can just sit here. Thank you.